Hi, I'm Rob from robandphoto.com, and today we're going to be having a quick look at the Canon 100 to 300mm fixed aperture f5.6 push-pull zoom lens, which I guess you could almost describe it as a vintage lens since it came out, I think, in about 1989. It was one of the first Canon EF zoom lenses for their new range of EOS EF, the EF mount and the EOS film cameras, which means that it's obviously compatible with all the latest DSLRs as well, the Canon ones anyway. You can see it's got kind of like the metal mount. So you may be asking yourself, why this old lens? Well, I'm always on the lookout for bargains, and I saw this one for sale on Gumtree, which I guess is a bit like the UK equivalent of Craigslist, going for a measly £40. And they said it was in good condition, it worked and everything like that. And the reason why I wanted a EF zoom lens was because although my favourite zoom lens is the Canon EF 55 to 250 IS lens, which is a fantastic lens. This one, it's image stabilized, so you can use it down to quite low shutter speeds and it'll look after you. It's fabulously sharp as well. It's great for portraits, telephoto work and everything. But it's an EFS lens. So what that means is that the mount is slightly different, and that the design of the lens is slightly smaller, so it can be lighter. But the problem with that is that if you want to go really long, and if, like me, you're a bit of a budget photographer and you want to use a teleconverter like this Jessops one, which I picked up from the car boot for, I think, £5, and I've been wanting to play with it a long time, this won't work on EFS lenses. It just doesn't fit. However, on these old EF lenses, well, you can still buy EF lenses, 75 to 300, all the full frame cameras and the full frame lenses are EF mount, but this one is EF, so I can use it with a 2x teleconverter as well. And that kind of gets me out to 600mm, which is a really long way, isn't it? Which would be great for wildlife, I guess kind of sports a bit, but I'll come on to that in a moment. Air shows and things, but again, there's caveats to all this thing, because as we all know, one of the things about photography and photography kit is often compromise, and that compromise is normally about price. And being a budget photographer, you've got to kind of work with these limitations. So the 100 to 300 lens, as I say, is a Canon EF lens, so it'll fit all Canon DSLRs, and it's very old, from about 1989. What that does mean, though, the build quality is pretty good. As we say, it's got a metal mount. It's a push-pull design, like that, so you don't spin it to zoom it, you push and pull it. It's got manual focus and then two forms of autofocus, 2 meters to infinity and macro to infinity. What that means is if you're working up fairly close, you'd put it on the macro to infinity and it will focus. But the problem with that is, because this doesn't have an ultrasonic motor on, the focus isn't that quick. So by limiting the range from 2 meters to infinity, the camera won't bother trying to focus closer, so it can grab onto your subject a lot quicker. I haven't done much macro work with it, but like any sort of 300mm, when they call them a macro lens, but they're not really macro. This isn't a dedicated macro lens. To get macro out of it, what you do is you zoom all the way, and then you go to the closest focusing distance. It's not full-time manual focusing, and as you can see, when you do focus, the front element does spin round. So if you're using filters and things like that, circular polarizing filters, that would obviously affect it. Now this one, which I got, I say, from Gumtree for 40 quid, it is very, very clean indeed, and I was lucky they kept it in a case. I don't really think they know what they had, and it had the end cap on. It didn't have a lens cap on, but what it did have was a circular polarizing filter, oddly enough, on the front, which was pretty much jammed on, so I had to use the old rubber band trick to flick it off, and that meant that the front element is really quite clean, and not a mark on it, no fungus or anything like that. So overall, it's a heavier lens than the 55 to 250. It does have the manual focusing window as well for working out depth of field and things like that. But it's big. limitation, if you like, that you have to work around is that f5.6 maximum aperture, which is the same over the whole focal length. So what that means is it's quite a slow lens, and whereas with the 55 to 250, although that's still 5.6 at the long end, because it has image stabilization, that kind of helps you out a bit. You know, so with this lens, when you're at the long end, when you're at 300 millimeters, you've really got to be shooting at least 1/300th of a second. If you're hand holding, more like 1/500th of a second to eliminate camera shake. Whereas with the 55 to 250, that gives you a couple of stops, so you could really be shooting at like 250 or even like 1/125th of a second. So that's a bit of a limitation. In reality, what that means is that if you're shooting static subjects like buildings or landscapes, or subjects that aren't really moving very fast, let's say wildlife that's just sitting there, then you know you can just use a tripod, can't you? But if you're trying to shoot moving subjects or sports, a couple of things are going to give you a bit of a problem. The autofocus is pretty slow, and as I said, that slow shutter speed, that small maximum aperture, means that your shutter speed is going to be longer. So even if you stabilise the lens and keep it steady so you don't have any camera shake, your subject's going to be running along, and so you're going to get subject blur instead. Now, funny enough, even though this is an older lens, you may well find if you've got a more modern DSLR, more modern than my 350D anyway, it's actually more of a better match, because more newer DSLRs work much better at high ISOs. So whereas with my 350D, if I'm running at 800, well really 400, 800 or 1600, it starts to get grainy and images get a bit flat and noisy. If you're running, you know, a later DSLR that can run at 1600, 3200, 6400 and they're nice and clean, well, this is going to be great, isn't it? Because you can run it at f5.6 or and I'll talk about that in a minute, and it's going to be no problem at all. You could even hand hold it because your shutter speed will be nice and high. Now, I've done some testing with the sharpness of the lens, and what I found is at 5.6 at the long end at 300mm, it's a little bit soft. Whereas if you stop down to f8, that then gives you much more contrast, clarity and sharper images. And what I'll do at the end of the video, I'll put a few of the test shots in. I haven't done that many, but just to give you kind of a flavour of it. And also, I put in the 2x Jessops extender on. Let me show you now. There we go. So now we've got the Jessops 2x extender, so that doubles it, so we get up to 600mm. However, what you've got to bear in mind is when you're using something like an extender, although you can double your focal length, you are losing out an awful lot of light, and I think it's about 2 stops of light as well. But, I mean, that's how big it is. It's huge, isn't it? Which brings in more issues about shutter speed. So if you were shooting at f8 to get maximum sharpness out of the lens, and you put on your 2x teleconverter, and say you would manage to get it to a 500th of a second, all of a sudden you're not shooting at a 500th of a second, you're shooting at say 1/125th of a second, which is a big problem if you're hand holding with that sort of focal length. It just isn't going to work. So what you need to do then is you'd have to use the camera on a tripod, or again use a camera where you can pump up that ISO very high so your shutter speed goes up, or use it on sunny days. You know, I mean, especially if you're imagine you're shooting wildlife on a sunny day, all of a sudden your shutter speed is going to be up around about 1/1000th of a second anyway if it's nice and bright and sunny. But if you're shooting like at dusk or dawn, it could be a real problem. Again, you can stabilise the camera, you can use a tripod, but that's not going to help you with the subject movement of stuff. So you've got to be careful that way. Now, you may well have noticed on here as well, I've added a little elastic band. This is because what happens to push-pull lenses over time is they kind of wear, and you get lens creep. See that? Imagine you were doing you had it on a tripod, the lens can move up and down. Now obviously there's not much I can do about that. I'd have to physically hold the lens. In fact, we could probably lock it in place, but especially if you're working on a tripod, just put the elastic band there, and that stops the lens creep, which I think is quite cool. So there we go. So we've got this old Canon 100 to 300mm, which you can find them on eBay. I wouldn't pay much more than 40 to 50 pounds for one anyway. You're better off, if you haven't got a zoom lens already, save up and buy the 55 to 250 IS. Because this is a really fantastic lens. I think it's incredibly underrated. It's definitely my favourite lens. I prefer to using this to the 51.8 for portraits and stuff like that. And you can normally get these, even brand new, from Amazon. They sometimes go down to about 120, 130 pounds, and it's a fabulous lens. However, if you haven't got the cash for one of those, and you do see one of these going cheap, by all means grab it. And there's different variations of it. You get the 100 to 300 f5.6. You get the newer variable aperture one, and then you get things like the 75 to 300, which I have reviewed on my YouTube stream already, which is a fine lens to have. But these IS lenses, this 55 to 250, is very, very special indeed. However, if you've already got one of these and you want to go further, so you want to use a teleconverter and you want to go 300 and then 600, this could be a good buy. The reason why I've got it, and I've got one, is I want to do a bit of moon photography, especially where the camera's going to be on a tripod. I'm going to be using the extender. We're going to be out at 600mm. I'm going to be at f8 or f11 to get the most sharpness out of the lens. And then I'm going to try taking some photographs of the moon, because at 250, this isn't really long enough, and especially on a camera like the 350D, which is 7 megapixels, which is less than my mobile phone camera, you can't crop that much. I have taken a couple of shots of the moon during the day, which again you'll see at the end of the video. But there we go. So not to be dismissed, the Canon EF 100 to 300 f5.6 lens. Slow focusing, slow maximum aperture, but as long as we work around these limitations, we can get the most out of this lens and find definitely specific situations where it's going to shine, which is probably, funnily enough, going to be on sunny days. Okay, my name's Rob from robandunphoto.com. Thanks for watching the video.